1. Blood alignment negativity theory. Z. Research into blood alignment negativity theory became popular in the late 1980s, though remained a secretive and lucrative sideline of the major scientific companies. It was one of a series of research lines that gained in prominence as politicians turned to science to come up with a solution to, or at least an explanation for, the reasons for the failure of Western economies and the unacceptable levels of persons deemed below the quality threshold desired for the proper upkeep of society. Science as a diagnostic tool was considered vastly superior to the extolment of extremist views against one section of society to demonstrate their culpability for the planet's woes. Those entrusted with the role of reaching this conclusion were not likely to take into account variables such as the fabled 1% of the population in whose hands most of the planet's wealth was held, or other factors that would lead to a significant change in the former's setup, which was thought to be perfectly effective yet ruined by a combination of overpopulation and ill-constructed DNA profiles. The suggestion was made in a 1992 conference in The Hague that there was indeed a surplus, of around 10% of the world's population, but also that said surplus had a negative effect of holding back the two main groups identified for success, potential performers and intentional conformers. This meant a human imbalance of around 1/4. Thus the elimination of this group would lead to a more than proportional increase in terms of yield and profit for the planet as a whole. Research into a means of profiling these individuals to devise a plan for their control continued throughout the 90s and into this century. Elimination was not a watchword that those in command positions allowed to be uttered, but it was clear that any surplus would require a cull, however abhorrent this may appear on the surface. Once the culprits were identified, public opinion would be moved in such a way to defend what was seen as rightfully owned by the other 75 to 85%, allowing for a modicum of fervor and underlying hatred to set the wheels of change in motion. In the meantime, the media tried its hardest to decry other groups as the perpetrators of the world's ills. None were convincingly proven as being anywhere scientifically liable for anything on a grand scale, but there was growing evidence that the surplus population was not only having a negative effect on business and economic growth, but also causing a latent decline in the output of otherwise hard-working people, who, under the auspices of the decent and productive top 75%, would be able to pull themselves from the mire. The government had special interest in isolating any sort of gene or mutation that would allow for a program involving the sterilization, and/or extermination of this dangerous group, yet they knew that they could not act without scientific proof. With the millennium drawing to a close, pressure was exerted on all those involved in the secret research to give the Prime Minister the boost he needed to enter the 21st century with renewed optimism. The first breakthrough was to isolate a DNA trait that was directly linked to laziness. At first, through the studies into this scientific field, progress was slow, as scientists were determined that the problem could be solved through the analysis of our genetic makeup, overlooking one major aspect that was common to nearly 10% of the world's population. The idea that it was something gene-based rather than race-based was both a revelation and a relief. The idea of taking on an ethnic group would pose endless issues, especially with the burgeoning emergence of social media in the second part of the first decade. DNA strand 326B was found to be present and could be linked to low performance in persons from all walks of life, yet its detection was slow and cumbersome. Plus, it was not conclusive, as there were also carriers of the strand who had outperformed other non-strand carriers in a range of indicators. Further to this was the fact that variations of the strand could be confused as pure strand and lead to the exclusion of nearly 30% of the population. Thus, it was deemed that one could be lazy and productive, or one's laziness might not necessarily hinder their ability to be productive at another time. No, the isolation process needed to determine exactly which person carried the strain of 326B that caused all of society's problems. Visionaries often appear at the most unlikely times, and it was a team of researchers in a lab off the west coast of Scotland who began to abandon the idea of the DNA route and work on the isolation of blood itself. The idea that a certain race had a greater propensity to failure held no truck with any viable government plan to create a level of stability for the planet as a whole. Governments worked together, all colors and creeds accepting the idea that a surplus in this issue was a bad thing, and, as the scientists were beginning to prove, every nation had its own group of culpable surplus. This meant that there could be no calls for victimization of any group. If it was just a clean cull of between 10 and 15% from all walks of life and colors, then the common good would triumph. Dissenting voices would be quashed or simply silenced as the excess could be enjoyed. A song and a dance and a bit of a fuss might occur at the beginning, but after that, people's natural greed and maleficence would restore things to a more natural order. And so, the lab began to work in different areas, namely the new field of blood alignment negativity theory, which works simply along the lines of rather than focusing on the DNA strand, they aimed to prove that entire sets of people with a certain blood group embodied the entirety of the problems faced by the world. Some of these blood group carriers had managed to pull the wool over the rest of the planet's eyes by accessing positions of responsibility and renown, but this was not the norm and their performance ratings were still vastly below that of people from other blood groups. As 2020 drew closer, the US government demanded a conclusive answer as the fabled recovery after the most recent depression failed to be the boom period that had been forecast. Thus, in a groundbreaking paper published in May 2019, scientists from the lab proved beyond any doubt that the defective blood group was indeed B negative and that all the carriers of this blood type were an unnecessary burden on society. How this was proven was conveniently kept secret from the rest of society, and, for the good fortune of the writer, from all sources on the internet. Suffice to say that all relevant boffins and political experts considered the theory to be sound and accurate. Whilst the details of the theory were kept away from eyes that may pry and prod and pick holes in its veracity, its idea was slowly allowed to filter outwards. A tried and trusted method. A clumsily leaked email made its way to a sensationalist tabloid which, seizing the chance to stir up public agitation and claim the scalp of the previously designated politician and scientist scapegoat, hastily published a story claiming that a subversive group aimed to prove that all carriers of the blood group B negative, immediately still as to B negs, were the source of all the world's woes. Inevitably, the theory was decried as nonsense, the scapegoats roundly chastised on social media and TV, enjoying a week as the world's most hated people and then swiftly forgotten upon the breaking of the next story. But the seed was planted, people began to ask whether there could be anything in it. People began to seek out B-negs and analyze their performance at work, their effect on others. If anything, the initial furor around them led to an increase in their working yield, as if they felt under the spotlight at all times to outwork any of their non-BNEG colleagues. The phenomena began to take hold, slowly at first, then gathering momentum, to the government's delight, as the inevitable hashtag of #ShameABNEG took hold of Twitter. B-negs were exposed on social media, often with side-by-side videos of them pretending to be hard at it juxtaposed with another showing their true colors. No movement is complete without the willing force of the uneducated hatred of the mindless masses. Non-B-negs who were unemployed began to feel aggrieved that their post had been taken by work-shy B-negs. Employers sensed a certain amount of exertion on them not to hire or promote B-negs, or even to remove them from their workforces. All of this gathered pace without any of the concerned governments having to spend a single centime, cent, or penny on further research. The hatred bubble was mushrooming of its own volition. The more people seen as reasonable and learned tried to denounce the plausibility, simple social media opportunities presented themselves to further the idea that there really was something to it. Libertarians and voices of reason were the easiest targets to remove. Why would people who had chosen to believe that life's lottery was preventing their advancement due to the continued support of a worthless group listen to reason suddenly? The proof was there was a paper, no one had seen it but it was known, it contained the facts. The easiest tap-ins were when the experts actually carried B-negative blood, so much so that often any voice considered of any worth beforehand refused to opine on matters concerning bans, as this was now still is, bearing in mind that the supporters of the movement would be less likely to follow something that used up most of their Twitter character allocation on spelling the name. The Z had no place in the theory, but the marketing company believed that it would appeal to the younger non-BNEGs. With sufficient support from the grassroots sections of society, the moment arose to begin taking steps to remove BNEGs from prominent positions. A bill was proposed whereby any organization with BNEG senior executives would have to justify their choice of employment against a criteria checklist, practically impossible for the BNEGs to come out on top, and should said BNEGs fail to meet these criteria, they were to be immediately replaced by non-BNEGs. A similar situation was devised for BNEGs running SMEs. To be able to continue with their business, they would have to pay a standard PAYE rate of 50% and increase takings with profit sharing for non-BNEGs. The thinking here was to price them out of the market and thus force them to abandon their professional endeavors. There was another option on the table: the BNEGs companies could be transferred to non-BNEGs so that the latter could run them and keep on the original BNEGs as employees, though a law passed the week after limiting BNEGs earnings to £600 per month, taxable at 49% too. BNEGs from all spheres were forced onto the streets. Plans were made to counter any rise in crime as a result of these undesirables by imposing harsher sentences on BNEGs for any type of misdemeanor. To finance this increase in potential prison population, BNEGs had their assets stripped and could have no more in savings than £1,000 or the equivalent amount in the local currency of the applicable nation. It turned out that BNEGs had more disposable income than was expected for such a lazy group, and this windfall allowed for further expansions of the plan. Whilst certain sectors of society felt bemusement and even bewilderment at the measures arbitrarily taken against people simply for their blood group, governments chose to ignore these, as public opinion shifted in their favor like never before. Whenever questions were raised, they were roundly discarded by the findings of a throwaway boffin who came up with fancy-looking PowerPoint presentations that were the scientific equivalent of photoshopping a supermodel's body onto a wallflower's head and expecting people to fall for it. Of course, they did. They lapped up everything that was thrown at them. The more ludicrous the better, the more obvious the lies, the more they learned them word for word and repeated them with glee among their friends, colleagues and on social media. Increases in GDP due to heavy taxation and appropriation of BNEGs goods meant that the UK government could afford a 3% income tax decrease and pay all non-BNEG workers a Robin Hood windfall bonus of £1,000, with unemployed BNEGs forced to fill their posts for free, should the non-BNEGs decide to take a holiday with the money. The next thing to plan for was the BNEGs uprising. They would surely not take this lying down forever, and any excuse to tighten security against them would provoke little opposition and would indeed prove doubters wrong. Sporadic groups of non-BNEGs had already begun to form vigilante squads to ensure order in the BNEG ghettos that were appearing on the outskirts of major cities. BNEGs were no longer allowed to live in an area within 5 miles of the city center, and then only in government-approved zones with a limited yardage and value. Pockets of BNEGs resistance tried to demonstrate, but they knew their hands were tied. If they tried anything, reprisals on groups of BNEGs could be disastrous. If they tried nothing, their remaining, few, civil liberties would be completely removed. This logical outlook could not be sustained for a group comprising nearly a tenth of the population. And so, inevitably, a group of BNEGs entered a government research center and set fire to the place, killing 3 non-BNEGs. Revenge was imminent. The night after the fire, hundreds of BNEGs were attacked randomly as comeuppance for the actions of the twisted fire starters. Many of their residencies were looted and burned, with the government passing an emergency measure that no BNEG could be on the street without registered accommodation. Anyone failing to comply with this measure could be immediately imprisoned until they had earned enough to make a deposit on a new property, depending on the waiting list, which was now much longer due to the events of the night known as the Night of the Long Platelets. The incident left more than 1,000 BNEGs dead and many more wounded. As BNEGs, they were not eligible to use the national health system and so would have to pay for medical treatment, which they obviously couldn't do, or take their chances at the BNEGs health centers, woefully underfunded and staffed by unqualified psychopaths. Within a week of the event, statistics claimed 7,000 BNEGs had been removed as a burden on society. With disease and poverty rife amongst them, the stage was set to up operations. Killing 4,000 over a couple of weeks would not be a feasible means of removing such a large section of society. We have obviously moved on from the dark ages of transporting them to camps and putting them in ovens. The future was soon assured by passing a law which meant that all bean eggs males had to be sterilised. Nobody checked whether bean eggs would always have BNEG offspring, but the measure was deemed appropriate and subsequently adapted for BNEG females. In theory then, no more bean eggs would be born, but there were still around 600 million on the planet. Waiting for them to starve to death would take an eternity, so the onus was left on the country with most bean eggs in the world, Australia, to find a solution. The solution was simple, a kind of home share plan. All the world's bean eggs would occupy Australia until they died. The non-BNEG residents of Australia would be given accommodation in the country of their choice until the problem had been resolved, though the thought of an island with 600 million cadavers on it made return less appealing. All Australian citizens accepting the plan were given $500,000. Those rejecting it would be left in Australia. All bean eggs possessions and worldly goods were to be divided between the relocated non-bean eggs to compensate them for the upheaval that this would involve. And so, on the 19th of July, 2031, container ships carried thousands of bean eggs to their final destination in Australia. All residents of the former British colony were removed by plane or ship to leave the island free of any type of transport, thus preventing escape. Boats carrying the bean eggs administered a muscle relaxant in the water to prevent any uprisings, turning their cargo into docile harmless cattle traveling to their fate. As the boats were paid for the number of trips made, unscrupulous captains hit upon the idea of emptying their cargo in the middle of the ocean and returning for more, though this practice was soon decried as the number of BNEG corpses washing up on the shore caused issues for local non-BNEG residents. Towards the end of the 2020s, special container ships were built with separate engine and cargo compartments, the biggest the world had ever seen. In conditions of almost zero comfort, up to 35,000 passengers could be transported in an almost harmless sleep to their last port of call. Each participant country, by that I mean every country, undertook to build a number of these proportionate to their BNEG population. The UK had 7 of these vessels, France 5, Germany 8 and the USA 24, even landlocked countries were obliged to have an amount of them and store them at their nearest port, except Switzerland, which once again never got involved and still maintained a high level of bean eggs and saw no drop in GDP. Bean eggs tried to emigrate to places like Switzerland, first choice, or Albania, with reservations, or Kyrgyzstan, a step up from death, but these nations soon closed their borders as they were swamped. So, at any one time, there could be more than 1 million bean eggs under transportation to Australia. This meant that the entire process by this method would take less than 3 years. Even so, that was considered a lengthy and burdensome process. From places like China, Japan, and New Zealand, bean eggs were simply ushered onto military transport planes and airdropped to Australia, with roughly enough parachutes for 60% of the plane's load to ensure a reduction in numbers early on. The problem with Oz was always going to be distance. The reason it was chosen, it being so far away, was also a major hindrance of the logistics. It was also a complicated business getting someone from Utah, for example, to a port where they could board a ship to Australia. As the celebrations for the 10 millionth recorded death of bean eggs came to a close, certain voices began to suggest that it might be time to relent on such severity. These voices of dissent were immediately quashed. The destruction of the bean eggs and their errant blood group had gone beyond a mere crusade to improve standards of living. Too many people had vested interests and were even looking beyond the bean eggs, should the promised utopia be spoilt by the unsightly presence of the working class. Even people generally seen as wishy-washy lefties began to change their outlook as momentum gathered for what was billed as definitely not a final solution. Research was done also to see whether bean eggs could be sent into space to colonize the moon, but that was eventually discarded when real scientists were consulted once more. the decision was made to use Alaska as a temporary Australia annex where B-negs could be taken and frozen to death. Nothing was hidden anymore, there was no tiptoeing around the subject. News chains and independent groups proudly reported on successful eliminations. Fox News came up with the slogan that 600 million is a lot, but if we all kill one or two, it's a lot less. With the reduction in the amount of electricity needed to heat and water this massive group of people, older power stations could be converted into huge furnaces. As many renowned voices concurred, not everything the Nazis did was that bad. They did create a lot of dust though. Luckily, a formula was discovered soon after, or always known and considered inappropriate, of how to combine mineral water with human ash to create fully functional bricks ideal for housing. In no time, the cost of building a house was reduced by more than 10%. With non-B-negs with more disposable income now, this meant reduced mortgages and fewer foreclosures. GDP took a huge swing upwards as the construction industry soared again. In some places, B-negs fought tooth and nail for their right to live, but even in Russia, where the strongest B-negs were found, the non-B-negs simply closed their doors in November and opened them in March. A winter indoors wins wars, Pravda proudly stated. By 2040, there was an estimated world BNEG population of just 11 million people, easily identifiable and avoided with the B stamp on the top of their hands. The drugs they had been given caused all their hair to fall out, and any means of covering the marking was punishable by transportation. Many of these had aided and abetted the destruction process. Australia had been declared uninhabitable, although daring farmers found that the arid soils of the desert lands, once fertile laced with the rotting corpses of more than 400 million people, turned it into one of the most fertile wheat and cereals production areas in the world. This meant that bread and rice were basically free now to anyone in the world. The top 1% was now the top 7%, and everyone, unless they were too lazy not to be, was better off by at least 10%. The figure of 10% became the benchmark against which everything was measured, with the idea being that, if it yielded 10% more, it was worthwhile. Peace was declared on the remaining 6 million B-negs on the anniversary of the end of the Second World War in 2045. 100 years to the day since the Nazis were quashed, there were no liberators for those still clinging to life. The only rights that they were afforded were those in place just after the initial resolutions preventing them from ownership and positions of responsibility. Most were old and frail, infirm, and unable to work anyway, before taking into account the rather ungentlemanly disservice of allowing themselves to be slaves once more. Most just wandered the streets begging, waiting for whatever force had brought them to the planet to take the ailing frames away from it so they could be with their long-departed souls. One day, before the daily visits of the shrine that is now the Old Lab in Scotland, receiving thousands of visitors a week to give thanks for the sterling work done to cull the Earth's population, one of the intern scientists stumbles upon a box that looks like it has not seen the light of day in more than 30 years. Inside he found the original formulae and calculations that led to the great discovery that isolated blood group B negative from the remainder of society and cast them out like dogs into the night. The intern took the papers and returned to his desk. Despite having the most advanced calculation technology on hand, he, like the scientists involved in the project, preferred to do his calculations by hand. Most of it was fairly standard up to the point of the DNA strand, then it is when theories began to diverge and the calculations seemed to be askew. He went through them twice and gave out an exclamation that was not exactly befitting of the discovery: "Gosh, it was never B negative." He repeated the calculations and looked at the demographic figures. At no time in history had there been 9% of the population with B negative blood, rarely had it exceeded 3. It seemed that the group had been chosen at random to begin the elimination process of all carriers of that type. He found the names on the header and checked them against the records. The findings were signed and approved by the deputy head of the unit, without the approval of the chief researcher, a man, it turned out, who spent his whole time trying to belittle the deputy. The chief was relieved of his duties soon after, his medical examination stating his blood group as being B negative. On the back page, a message was written in Biro that said, "You'll be fools to believe all this Palm 2019, and a second message, "That's why it's so believable RKC 2038.